same title, and we decided to read it because it was really interesting, and something clicked, and I was like, I actually think I know one of the authors from a previous life. He lives in Boston. You should just come and talk about it. So, really happy that you're here, and with that, go for it. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Today, I'd like to talk about, I guess, federal democracies in general. It's going to cover a lot of ground. The style of research I do is more high level, looking at the whole and then making like a few divisions rather than starting with the parts. Sort of a bird's eye view of federal democracy. And so the idea is that federal government rests on three pillars. The first two pillars have been talked a lot about, like how do you internally structure government in a multi-scale fashion with federal, state, local, bit of other levels as well. And then there's also the multi-scale complexity of the policy environment, even outside of government. Society, of course, is multi-scale structures. And, you know, if you had a benevolent dictatorship, that's sort of all you would have to worry about. But because, you know, we have a democracy, the third thing is the distribution of political opinions, which, as we'll see, are nothing close to well mixed. And so the multi-scale distribution there needs to be considered as well. And so as a brief outline of this talk, first I'll overview a perspective that complexity science can tell us about the first two pillars. And then before getting to this third pillar, I'll take a little detour just to examine in a single election, not multi-scale, what does representation look like? Because it's a little more complicated than one might expect. And then finally, we'll then bring in the third pillar. So to start with the first two pillars, I don't know how many of you have heard of Ashby's law of requisite variety, but it's really a glorified pigeonhole principle. If there are more different things that the environment can do than that the system can do, then sort of inevitably the system is not going to be able to appropriately respond or regulate the environment. If the system's complexity, i.e. its number of possible behaviors, is greater than or equal to that of the environment, then then at least on that front, you're in the clear. There are a lot of other things that could go wrong. But this sufficient system complexity for its environment could be considered a necessary but not sufficient condition for a system effectively interacting with its environment. Now, the thing with complexity, though, is that a natural concept you might ask is at what scale? Like, for instance, am I more complex? Or if you take me and vaporize me, is that gas more complex? That gas has more different possible states, higher entropy. So in one way, that gas is more complex. And another way, the gas is much more simple, can be described by pressure, volume, temperature, while I have a lot of much larger scale behaviors. So there's this idea that complexity really depends on scale. In a fully random system, we see that, you know, most of the complexity is at a very small scale with very little at larger scales. On sort of the other extreme, in like a fully coordinated system where like every component is a copy of every other one. For instance, like if I throw a bowling ball, every atom sort of doing mostly the same thing, you have sort of constant complexity over time. And then for a human being, you have something that is slowly decreasing. And a lot of multi-scale or systems that we stereotypically think of as complex will have this complexity profiles that look like this. And the idea is that we want to extend this notion of this law of requisite variety to multiple scales. It's not enough to just have the same amount of complexity as your environment. You have to have the same amount of complexity at each scale at which you interact. And just to take a brief detour before getting back to politics, give an example of military conflict. So over here, we might have two armies that have the same complexity, same number of different possible behaviors, but one of them is just larger than the other. Maybe it has more firepower, maybe it has more soldiers. So the behaviors are the same, but clearly the larger scale one is favored to win. In another case, you could have two armies that operate at the same scale, Same firepower, same number of shoulders, but one just has more different possible behaviors it can do, and so will be able to outmaneuver the other army. And then this third case, it's like, well, what happens if which army has more complexity varies at scale, depending on the scale. And then there you could have like sort of a quagmire where here you might have like a guerrilla force that doesn't have large scale power, but has a lot of small scale complexity and flexibility. And over here you might have like, you know, a larger scale traditional superpower. And that's how you get like quagmires like Afghanistan and Vietnam, where, you know, if the smaller scale army were to meet on open terrain, which favors larger scale behavior, the larger scale army would win. But of course, they don't do that. So this is just a brief example of the importance of matching. I just wanted to give sort of like something slightly more abstract before getting into policy. By the way, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask throughout. No need to save them for the end. So getting back to the first two pillars of government, this might be, you know, we could disagree about the exact values, but essentially this might be like the complexity of the policy environment or of the thing trying to be managed by government. At the individual level, there's the most complexity. And then as you get to larger scales, the descriptions become simpler. And federal governments are often hierarchical. And there are different ways you can run a hierarchy. On one extreme, everything is controlled at the top level. And in that case, the complexity at all scales is sort of the same, because if you know what's happening at the top, you know what's happening in every case. And in the other case, you could give lower levels some autonomy. Now, I would claim that the US government is actually much closer to this than to this, despite our federal system. And the reason is you can just look at tax flows. As an individual, you pay probably like 3/4 or more of your taxes to the federal government, which means that the federal government is not only larger than any individual state or local government, but is like, you know, approximately 3 times larger than all state and local governments combined. So we're in a very top-heavy system, and we sort of just take that for granted as if that's like normal and good. We'll explore whether that's actually the case. So want to transition to a single election here. And another thing we sort of take for granted is that these large swings in election outcomes are normal. We, you know, in my lifetime, we've gone from George Bush, who's considered pretty conservative, to Obama, pretty liberal, someone even more conservative, to someone at least policy-wise has been the most progressive candidate, and then of course back. So we have these wild swings. And the question is, you know, one possible answer we could say is, okay, well, this is actually representative of the electorate. The electorate is just like every 4 years shifts from being super conservative to super liberal and back again. But if you believe in some stability and preferences where, yes, maybe there are shifts in how conservative or liberal the electorate is, but they're much smaller than these shifts in outcomes, then you see that there has to be this real problem with representation. How can it be said that both Biden and Trump represent the same electorate? And I think, in fact, you'd be hard-pressed to find any voter who has a very positive opinion of both Biden and Trump. I think you could find plenty of negative opinions of both. But and so there's this real question of like, are we being represented? What's going on here? Yes.
So the extremes seem to be a modern phenomenon, right? I'm old enough that I remember like Clinton getting in, or like Bush the senior getting in, right? And they were different, but not that different. Mm-hmm. Right, and in fact, that's why like part their money in the States, because like, there are certain policies that continue on regardless of which side of the aisle you are in. Are you going to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'll get to this.
Kind of big swing.
Yes, there's the claim I'm going to make is that there is a phase transition that occurred in around 1970. I'll get to that in a bit. Yeah.
And then so now we're just
well, even there was even with, let's say, Clinton versus H.W. Bush, there was still growing polarization. It's gotten worse and worse over time, but it's not like Reagan was considered a somewhat like polarizing figure, and Carter was pretty, yeah.
But some of it's that maybe there's delays in us seeing what policies actually have an impact on society, like the trickling down of wealth or whatever, right? So it doesn't happen immediately.
With the swings, I'm sort of talking about the election outcomes. And yes, I think there can be feedback loops that cause us to exacerbate over time. There's also just been an increasingly polarized electorate. Maybe could I get back to your question after I? Thank you. So for a single election notion is what is this electoral instability? How would I define it mathematically? And I'm trying to keep this talk relatively high level. So, but essentially the notion is that an election could be thought of as a map from citizen opinions to the opinion of the elected official. This could be in any number of dimensions. And you could have a stable mapping where if I shift electorate opinions a little, that could be like a little push, the ball will move a little bit. Or you could have an unstable situation where like a small bias in either direction causes this large swing. And this is just a representation of that in one dimension. And a key result is that all unstable elections contain negatively represented opinions. So in addition to, instability being bad, perhaps because it's like hard to govern when you have such large swings, or because, if you have such a big swing, it really incentivizes a special interest to pour a lot of money into the election, because with a little bit of a push, they can maybe cause a large difference in policy. In addition to all of that, there's this even more fundamental breakdown in the notion of representation, where you would expect that if you take, let's say you hold everyone else's opinions constant, you take some portion of the electorate and you shift their opinions to the right, you would want counterfactually the election outcome to move to the right, and vice versa. And negative representation means that you can actually get the opposite effect. Just to give a example, if I think in like 2016, you were to take all Jill Stein voters and move them to come to the right to become more like centrist Democrats, such that they voted for Hillary Clinton, then the outcome would have been different. A lot of people, will talk about the Electoral College and whatnot. The model here is very general. We're not making any particular assumptions. It's just this like map, which is a black box. So I actually sort of view the Electoral College like the fact that it matters so much is evidence of this, or is a symptom of this deeper instability, that like, oh yeah, this relatively small rule in how you aggregate can, result in a dramatically different outcome. So in this model, we don't claim to know how people arrive at their political opinions. Surely there are some feedback loops where political elites, politicians can shape electorate opinion, and of course, electorate opinion determines who is elected and also who decides to run. But we consider sort of just one side of that feedback loop, the electorate opinions to the outcome, because I think psychology is very hard, and people form their political opinions in very personal, idiosyncratic ways. To some extent, maybe they align with their neighbors, to some extent not. So we sort of just take that for granted. And because this election is a black box, even things like which candidates choose to run, or which candidates are selected by primary process or some other process, is itself considered a function of the electorate. So there's a certain way where if you get to the general election and you have two candidates that are very far apart and it's going to be a close election, it's already an unstable election. Like the failure mode was that, we created two options so evenly split and very far apart. For it to be stable, either the two candidates, if they're evenly matched, they should be close together in opinion, or you would need a situation where one candidate was had a very sizable margin over the other. That could also be more stable. But we've had this polarize. All that's to say is that I'm sort of just taking this for granted. And of course, we can get into the causes of what causes polarization, but that could be very complicated. The question is, what effect does that have on the outcome? And now, if everyone were to vote and you were to basically have like median voter theorem type conditions, then it wouldn't actually matter. You would always still elect someone in the center. But in as much as people might choose to stay home or vote for third-party candidates, and also in as much as party primaries are not selecting candidates that are designed to win the general election, you can get some more polarizing tendencies. So we use a simple model where the electorate is polarizing, and the outcome for a symmetric electorate essentially undergoes this bifurcation. And so in this regime, and then over here, this H variable is essentially like a bias, like shifting the electorate from one side to another. So in the stable regime, even as you shift the electorate, the election outcome is smooth. You have this sort of critical point at this transition. And then in the unstable regime, you can see that there's this like, as the electorate moves from slightly right to left, there can be this sudden shift. And in this unstable regime, you can also show that the majority of the losing subpopulation is negatively represented, which sort of tracks our intuitive understanding of elections, where we see that, you know, at best, it seems that our presidential candidates are nowadays representing half the populace. So I put the term universality here because you might ask, how can like a simple model capture actual real world data about these candidates? And the answer is that phase transitions are a universal phenomenon. Many different systems can exhibit the same type of phase transition. So it's not important that the precise toy model that we use models exactly what's happening. And of course it doesn't, but just that it belongs to the same universality class. So over here, we used another paper that basically overlaid the ideology of party platforms, how far apart were they? And yeah, and we fit that, and we saw that, like I said, in 1970, there was it appears this was the best fit for the location of this bifurcation where candidates started to diverge. And there are a couple things that could cause that. For one, voter turnout has decreased over time, and the less voter turnout there is, the more incentive there is for candidates to appeal to their base, which is a polarizing tendency. Another thing is just that the electorate has become more polarized over time. And then the third thing that we can speak of is this is actually the introduction of political primaries. Before 1970, parties would sort of choose their candidates in back rooms, but with a goal of trying to win over the general electorate. Now, nowadays, maybe the electorate is polarized enough that a centrist candidate actually would not do well. But you could also imagine a situation where, you know, before they were trying to choose very centrist candidates because those were the ones with the broadest appeal. And, you know, nowadays, now that it's in the hands of the electorate, there are factions in parties that have a pull towards more extreme candidates. Are there any questions so far?
Just like one thought I had looking at this, how qualitative are these blue and red lines? Because you could imagine a sort of recency bias where somebody's like, oh, look, I know more about today's political climate. It seems horrible now, and back then, you know, those differences with 30 years of like historical hindsight don't seem big now. So I imagine it's much more.
Yeah. So what Jordan et al. Did is they basically did a machine learning, well, it was simple machine learning, but basically they just looked at like commonality of words in platforms, and based on that found like words that were polarizing, and applied that to the party platforms to sort of I mean, nothing's truly objective, but in a consistent way, assess how polarized the platforms were, how different was it in the way that people were talking. I'd say also, like, yes, it's nice to have this data, but I can just observe with my own understanding that politics was a lot less polarized in the past. In fact, political scientists around the 1950s, late 1950s and 60s, were complaining about how unpolarized politics were. Yeah, they said it would be better if we had a system more like Britain, where there was more incentive for polarization. All I can say to them is be careful what you wish for. So just to conclude for the single election, there are two regimes. They can be either stable or unstable. This is something that hasn't really been widely considered in the literature or even in like public discourse. The very fact that the candidates are so different represents a problem. Part of the reason why it hasn't been considered in the literature is that unstable elections don't really lend themselves to clean mathematical modeling. So you can look at all of like the political economy literature, and they literally, like, into the utility function of voters, bake in assumptions that ensure stability. And so as a result of the mathematically convenient assumptions, they leave out an entire regime of behavior. The unstable regime contains negatively represented opinions. So it, in a fundamental sense, represents a failure in representation, in addition to sort of pragmatic problems with these large swings. And then just said polarization of the political opinions can cause instability, low voter turnout, and the party primary system. So ranked choice voting, which is Cambridge city politics in Maine and Alaska, that can help reduce some of the effects here. I would be in favor of either like compulsory voting, or at the very least making like election day a national holiday. But what we're going to focus on really for the rest of the talk is actually polarization. So that this, just to keep in mind this idea that a polarized electorate leads to these problematic phenomena. So for federal democracies, and this is the paper you read, Eric, there are basically three key things that I want to talk about. First are that the opinion distribution is not well mixed. If all opinions were very well mixed, maybe this then like sort of all elections at all levels would essentially be the same. And so it could just be viewed as like many copies of this single election analysis. But there is in fact a lot of geospatial heterogeneity and correlation that needs to be accounted for. Another way we're going to extend this is social ties. The fact that maybe people vote, and in some way, how do we consider maybe what Alexis de Tocqueville would call like enlightened self-interest, that people don't just vote their own opinion, but have some sort of sense of political community or drive for consensus. And then the final thing are this thing that I term election axes. But essentially, everything up to this point, including the social ties, you could imagine a multidimensional opinion space, but all of the essential behavior is captured in one dimension. For this, it's like, what are phenomena that explicitly are a function of the fact that there are multiple issue dimensions? So we'll start with the opinion distribution. So this is a two-party vote share. And you can even see, just looking at this, that of course there's a multi-scale structure. But one thing we can do is we can, I guess I wrote sort of this in reverse order, but applying a KD tree where you make a vertical cut of the population in half, and then in each of those, and then once you make the vertical cut, actually, it looks like we made a horizontal cut first. And then after you do that, you then take each half and you make a vertical cut. And then after you do that, you just keep iterating. So you get the population a bunch of squares. There are other ways to do this too. Like you could do this in a way that respects state boundaries or county boundaries or whatnot. I don't think it affects the main point, which is that you see these variants in a political opinion that persists to very large scales. And I have this equation here. This is just like a multi-scale version of the law of total variance. But this term over here is essentially the variance at the largest scale. So it's just the variance of the means of each of these. The next term over here is the average of the variance within each of these blocks of the smaller blocks. So the total variance over here of all of this would be this term plus this term, the variance of the blocks overall plus the amount of variance in the blocks. And then you just keep iterating down until this is like the amount of variance in each of the smallest level places. And in a two-party thing, that variance is just going to be like p times 1 minus p. Where p is the probability of voting for either of the candidates. And so we can, so given this sort of breakdown, we can track what that looks like over scale. And you see that there's actually like, not exactly, because this isn't like truly scale free, but there's approximately the same amount of variance being added at each scale. Especially at smaller scales. At the larger scales, you do get some larger features of the geography of the US. And just for comparison, this was the purple line is a simulation. If you take all of the opinions and you sort of randomly spread them out and then look at the variance. And of course, you see a line of slope 1, which corresponds to the central on a log-log plot, which corresponds to the central limit theorem. So the variance would quickly decrease and you get very little deviation at large scale if, in fact, things were randomly mixed. But instead, we see this. And this is the same thing, just cumulative. And we can also look at, like, how did this change over time? And so this is sort of looking at all of these different scales. But you could sort of really see this really focusing on this slide is captures a lot of the key thing, which is that within any given county, the counties in the mid-century were the most like well mixed. And then as time goes on, you get counties with less variance, i.e. each county tends to lean either more conservative or liberal. And given that, that means there's going to be more variance at larger scales. And so you can see that reflected that the total variance within the county dips and now like has increased a lot. Same with the variance between states. But you see it especially pronounced at the county level, which is reflective of this like urban-rural divide. For reference, if all counties had the same distribution of political opinions, then there would be zero inter-county variance. And, we're not going to claim causality here just because two graphs sort of look the same, but using DW nominate scores, you do see that this does at least happen to coincide with a decrease in polarization mid-century, and then an increase again. There any questions so far?
Have you practiced with the other gerrymandering?
So the gerrymandering, this is just about political opinion for the two-party vote share. So gerrymandering wouldn't affect this because this is all presidential elections. County level returns for the yeah.
So this bottom left is it's like if the yellow curve, for example, is you just like chop the country into 4 chunks.
Exactly. So that's over here tracking like if you chop the country up like this, what is the variance? You know, there's just 4 numbers, and what is the variance of that over time?
If you arrive at like 2,000 chunks that aren't counties,
Mhm.
is that a similar level, or is there something about the county that's really making it so high in this variance? It's like the 1,000 is like.
Oh, yeah, right. So it's because it's the smallest scale that we're considering. So it's this term over here. So it's all of the leftover variance. The point is that each of these is the variance of something that's already aggregated, but then each county could have like hundreds of thousands of people in it. And so it's saying that there's still a lot of the variance is just in between individuals within the county. So each of these lines is a term here. But if I, for instance, were to cut it off at 256, then the smallest term there would then include all of the individual variance. And so you would add like this. Yeah, so if I cut it off, you'd have to add all of the variance here, because this is added variance, not cumulative variance. Good question, though.
Can you say a little bit more about the fact that the like kind of grid that you make doesn't matter? Like, is any kind of multi-scale coarse graining something we were talking about a little bit? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I guess I was basically saying that I have run this where you like respect state boundaries. So you have to first divide up the country by assigning states as evenly as possible to 4 sections, and then only once you do that do you go within the state, and the results look fairly similar. Obviously there are ways to divide up the country that don't respect its geography at all that would give you very different results. But I would say like sort of the exact borders of these lines are not that important.
I guess maybe one other question, looking across countries where there's sort of like ethnic minority groups that are concentrated in a different area.
Mm-hmm.
There you would see like, actually, have you done any like comparison across outside the US? And could you like, do you have any sense for whether this pattern of roughly uniform variance at each scale would apply? Like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't done that in total. I am familiar with work that just looks at distribution of ethnic groups and their structure and relates it to ethnic violence, which is very interesting. Essentially, if the ethnic groups are very well mixed or very well segregated, you don't get ethnic violence, but there's this middle case where you do. That's a whole other story, but I would say that if you were to, for instance, look at the United States around the Civil War period, perhaps you would see like, a very stark like north-south divide. So I'm not going to claim that you're always going to get like these sort of scale-free patterns. So yeah, one other thing I wanted to say about the opinion distribution is that the fact that, as you move to larger scales, you basically tack on more and more variance, in contrast to this random case where, it wouldn't really matter at the large scale, means that a larger scale election has to resolve more variance. So in addition to, other considerations regarding matching, what is the best scale of policy implementation? Like, is this like a sort of national weights and measures where I really want a local large scale, or is this like roads where it can be, in addition to those sort of like pragmatic considerations, we also have the fact that if you implement the policy at the national level, you're going to necessarily make more people unhappy, because no matter what you choose, the distance of people's preferences from that on average is going to be greater. And this is especially because the variance persists to very large scales. If you resolve a lot of issues at a small scale, a lot of difference in opinion can just sort of be ignored, because you can just let different locales do things differently. So that's even without considering social ties, but social ties exacerbates this picture. So again, as I've said, human opinion formation is complicated, and the effect of social interactions on it is doubtless also extremely complicated. And so I don't attempt to model that directly. Instead, I assume that people somehow arrive at like their, let's call it like their selfish opinion or their like personal opinion XJ, and then they have an effective or consensus opinion. And that consensus opinion doesn't change their like true belief. It's just sort of like their willingness to compromise, to vote as if they are taking some share of other people's opinion. So in like, you know, maybe like a small group that's working by consensus, it's not so much that everyone like leaves the group believing the same thing. It's more that, you know, people enter the group with different opinions. They leave, maybe their true belief changes a little bit as a result of deliberation, but they leave the group also with different opinions, but they're able to arrive at a consensus because they genuinely care about voting in such a way that respects the opinions of other people. And that sort of thing is what I'm trying to capture here. So you can use like the same model of the election, like the same function, the black box that takes in political opinions and outputs something, except you now sub in people's effective opinion or like enlightened opinion or whatnot for their like true belief. And this bypasses the need to say anything about how people form their beliefs because their true belief still remains as like an input to the model. And, you know, so if this matrix were homogeneous where every entry was the same, then you would have everyone's effective opinion being the same. That would be like a true consensus model where you don't even need to vote. You know, in reality, maybe it's something in between, but you know, political commentators such as Tocqueville have like commented that like democracy sort of relies on this. Like it doesn't actually work if everyone just like votes their own personal preference, because then you just get tyranny of the majority. There has to be some way in which there's like deliberation, and where even if people disagree, they sort of care about like some sort of consensus opinion to some extent. And that doesn't have to be perfect, which, and the rest of it can be like resolved by majority vote. And so we can ask, what does this have on this, like, you know, on this distribution now of like these effective opinions as opposed to the actual opinions? And in this model, these little w's are essentially the strength of social ties at a particular scale. So like the W1 would be at like the smallest level. How much do you take into account the people's opinion? So maybe you like care about the people in your neighborhood X amount, or W1 and then, you know, everyone in your state you have some sort of smaller allegiance to, and everyone in the country some smaller allegiance. These W's don't actually have to be monotonic. It could be like, yeah, I care about my neighborhood, and then I care about like the political opinions of America overall, and nothing in between. And that's fine. That's still captured in the model, because at each level you basically just like sum it all up. And so what you get is that the social ties, as you'd expect, reduce the variance at the smallest scale by a larger factor than they reduce the variance at the next smallest scale, you know, and then they reduce the variance at the national level by the smallest factor. And so, you know, in addition to whatever intrinsic additional variance you have due to these geographic correlations in political opinion, the effect of social ties is also going to effectively make smaller political units more homogenous, easier, less people unhappy when you choose a outcome. The idea is like, you know, if a policy is implemented that I don't like, but, you know, a lot of my neighbors I know like it, I'm going to feel like okay about that, probably, unless I like hate all my neighbors. But it's like harder to feel okay about a policy that you don't like being implemented with the consolation that some people over in some state across the country really like that policy. Yeah.
Is the corollary of that if there's already, like, if there's much lower variance at the lowest scales. Right now you have increasingly counties that are very blue or very red.
Yeah.
Social ties do less to reduce polarization overall because they act best on the low scale.
Yes, that's also a definite corollary for sure. So finally, I want to consider sort of explicitly a multidimensional opinion space. And then this gets like very tricky, and it's like very hard even in like the formal theory literature to talk about. And so what I essentially want to do here is a very high level model. I'm not actually making any assumptions. I'm just redefining the choice of variables I use, where in a two-party election at least, and if you had like three candidates, you could, instead of an axis, use like a plane. So I guess more generally an election subspace, but since we're talking about America, we can talk about axes. And even in countries with multiple candidates, there still tends to often be a dominant line along which discourse occurs. And so you can just like draw that line connecting the two candidates and then project everyone's opinion onto that line. And there's no assumption here, there's just a redefinition of what variables are important. But the idea is to actually treat these election axes themselves as the so-called like relevant parameter. We could consider this, similar to in physics where, instead of considering string theory, you consider like mass and charge of electrons as the relevant parameter. Or at a higher level, I'm not going to consider protons or neutrons, I'm just going to consider atoms. And so we have these election axes as units. The first thing I want to just say is that it can there's this thing in the political science literature that to some extent I think has been resolved, but people notice that the political elites seem to be way more polarized than than like average citizens. And part of that was due to like polls tend to suck in terms of measurement, in terms of how they ask the questions and whatnot. But another thing is like, you can imagine poll questions trying to understand polarization along a particular axis or along some notions of axis. And you could imagine politicians are really like honing in on the dominant social cleavage almost implicitly. I think Trump really did this. He revealed a divide in society that people didn't even like realize existed and which no one had really polled for. These, it doesn't really, it's like this, you can sort of get a psychological sense for like what's dividing people, but it doesn't really necessarily fit onto any of the traditional axes of like big government or small government or this or that. And so you might find that basically, and I think even before Trump, that was like largely true. People were trying to capture it when they talk about like culture wars and stuff, but just sort of like this psychological alignment that you might see present in the candidates that might be hard to otherwise see. Other thing I want to talk about are axis interactions. So the idea is that on a local level, you could have this dominant axis along which election occurs. And on a national level, you could also have an axis. But these aren't independent. That local politics can be affected by national politics. And vice versa, although nowadays less so. And so these axes can sort of bend towards each other. And that's sort of what I mean about like a theory where I treat these axes as a fundamental phenomena. And whether it's the local axes that bend more towards the natural national axis or vice versa, I term national versus local salience. So the founding fathers sort of, like Madison in particular, imagined this notion where the local axes were dominant, where local and state issues were the primary concern. And then sort of national would be this sort of aggregation of all of these local concerns that are sort of pointing in different directions. And that's why he claimed that the Union would serve as a check against the factions, because he assumed that at the federal government itself, you wouldn't get this factionalization, and then the federal government sort of sitting above the states could check the worst impulses of the states. And perhaps an example of this could be like the desegregation that was instigated by the federal government against the South in the 1960s and 50s. But nowadays, of course, everyone cares about national politics. Everyone knows more about what's going on at a national level often, at least based on the news they read, the social media they consume, which elections they turn out for, which campaigns they donate to, than they care about local elections. And this can, for one, cause local elections to skew towards the national ones. But even to the extent that that doesn't happen, the national axis is now unchecked by local concerns and can become very polarized. And you can get this vicious cycle where, well, people don't really trust local government to do things because no one really cares about local government. But then, of course, because of that, people just keep asking the federal government to solve their problems and the national salience increases. So it's like very easy to get stuck in this, what I would say is unhealthy concern at the national level. And you could see like how this might work in Congress. If everything's polarized at the national level, then in a congressional election, which maybe in the past reflected some sort of local concern, instead, all of these congressional elections are like are reflective of like a pre-existing national concern and just sort of reinforce this national divide, as opposed to a bunch of congressmen sort of representing different concerns and then that sort of coming together in like broad consensus at the national level. And in that period, a mid-century of relatively low polarization, that is sort of what happened. The Democratic Party and the Republican Party were sort of these broad coalitions where the nature of their coalition or the faction sort of depended on what area of the country. And because of that, that enabled them to compromise more. The final thing one could say is that because this is multidimensional, we can talk about like issue by issue. Like one dimension could represent, abortion, and another like taxes. And if an issue is particularly polarizing at the national level, one could reduce the scale at which it's implemented, and that could reduce polarization for that issue. Both because there might be less variance overall at local levels, but also just because the shape of the dominant social cleavage might be different depending on the scale. Like maybe at I think this did happen with abortion, where nationally it becomes this very like polarized issue where people easily sort into like two camps, but locally, in fact, up until it was nationalized in Roe v. Wade, it was like a lot more subtle and complex and didn't have quite the same dividing character. I guess another way to say that is that like locally people are concerned about a lot of grounded things, and so they're not necessarily going to align along like one issue that actually might be in many ways detached from their own personal life. While on the national level, it's very easy to sort of, in a very coarse-grained way, find some sort of psychological thing and just sort of latch on to that. So, to summarize, or did you have a question?
No, I'll say it.
All right. So to summarize, the main thing that we're sort of considering here is the scale of policy implementation and the various considerations. And the first two things we considered are like the two pillars. The first pillar, we could talk about economies versus diseconomies of scale. Not all things are done more efficiently when you scale them up. For instance, restaurants that are chains tend to be worse than non-chain restaurants, or at least at the upper end. But at the same time, there are obviously cases where it really does make sense to do things all at once. And then the other thing is coordination versus one size fits all. If you let every local government do their own thing, you can get tragedy of the common situations. But at the same time, if the federal government does it, you sort of have a one size fits all solution. So to me, both of these are like, legitimate, difficult tensions about how to manage society. That could sort of go one way or the other. But these of course still have to be managed. But then you also consider this third pillar of political opinion, which really points much more towards localizing government. which is not to say that we, should eliminate the federal government or exactly how far we should go, but it feels like a often under-considered reason as to why power should be dissolved. And so the first thing we talked about was due to the there's simply less variance to resolve at a local level due to geographic correlations. And of course, less polarization, as I mentioned in the middle of the talk, would lead to less instability and negative representation. And then this is exacerbated by social ties. And then the other thing is to consider this national versus local salience. I hopefully made an argument for why overly large national salience can be harmful in terms of a deliberative democracy, and how, the more things that the federal government does, the more of our taxes go to the federal government as opposed to state and local governments. Of course, that's going to draw our attention and increase the salience of the national government versus local government. And I think one other thing is just on like a personal level, and perhaps this has to do with social ties, but even beyond that, as an individual, you can just have way more say in your local government and feel much more like you are a part of your own destiny rather than being thrown about by forces beyond your control. And then we didn't talk about this directly, but of course there are feedback loops. Of course, it's not just political opinions that shape the outcome, but the reverse can happen as well. And so, the more polarized an outcome, you could easily imagine that feeding into a more polarized electorate, which may, to your question, be part of how this polarization sort of ramped up over time. And, finally, I want to say something about federal neutrality, at least as Madison imagined it. The federal government would be like a neutral-ish arbitrator because everyone's personal opinions would be mainly focused on their states. The federal government could be this more, wise arbitrator that could step in when necessary to resolve things, maybe imperfectly. But the more you lean on the federal government to do things, the more it gets hijacked and the less it's able to play that role or to be trusted. I'll now open it up to questions. Thank you.
Questions?
Yeah. One that we did, we separated temporal stability from modal robustness with these different scales. So for example, gerrymandering is not modally robust, right? I can redraw voting districts and now all of a sudden I have a lot more one party than another in Congress. And of course, since when you vote for the presidential election, you need just say ballot, that also affects what you do elsewhere. So have you considered doing the separation of possibility of modal robustness?
I have not considered gerrymandering in particular. I would say that the sort of the scale at which I'm examining these systems is at a bit of a higher level, where elections are still largely there's this more just abstract question of, I have a bunch of citizens with a bunch of opinions. How can I create outcomes that, even if everything did work perfectly, represent those opinions well? And so the results sort of, so yeah, the short answer is I haven't considered these more detailed questions of exactly how elections are implemented. But clearly, I guess one thing I could say about gerrymandering with this national versus local salience is that this gerrymandering is an example of local axes being local politics, because gerrymandering is done at the state and local level, sort of becoming increasingly dominated by federal concerns. Whereas, I think it was maybe originally envisioned that, that the flow would go the other way, that states would do something reasonable for them, and then that would just output the federal government, and that would be that.
Of course, we're at this stage now where Trump said that states are covered.
Right, which is, yeah.
Which I'm not sure what happened to state rights.
Yeah, it's everyone wants states' rights when their party is not in power, and I hope like one of the points of the talk is like, maybe it's important to push for, even though it's tempting when you have the power on the federal government to sort of impose your will on like everyone. I think there could be an important norm around, hey, we can focus on ourselves. We don't need to tell other people what to do. Yes.
I agree, like for a lot of policies, I think something I care about my background, like cities can't really, right, that kind of thing, and then sort of this issue that like so many other people, which a lot of it, I mean, like the federal government is like the size it is today because of large, and sort of like, is there a way to like maintain that, but also like evolve other things while still having, like trusting program? I just like can't see how we can have like
Right. I would argue that the Social Security program was done really poorly. It should have just been implemented as like a UBI for people above 65, which is sort of what it is, but with like a lot more bureaucracy and entanglements and, and separated funds and whatnot. And of course, it wasn't implemented by that for like sort of optics reasons and whatnot. Yeah, I think for redistribution, of course, there's this race to the bottom thing if you do it at a lower level. The way to do that at the federal government with like minimal intervention otherwise would just be like UBI, which would, increase the amount of money flowing through the federal government, but it would sort of, but in terms of what the federal government was doing, it would sort of be, well, the money comes in and then quickly like flows out again. And of course, there are other things like climate policy. Obviously, we all share the same air, so we can't, you can't do that state by state. But I do think there are a lot of things that can be reduced. I also think that, sort of viewing redistribution as something as a like the redistribution sort of replaces a lot of maybe like voluntary community efforts, and it is still true that local places will often have a lot of efforts either by local governments and or just by nonprofits that are, helping homeless populations and whatnot. So I do think there is a broader question of, and this is maybe a broader social paradigm of, but like, oh, can communities actually like in a real grounded way take care of their own or not? Very difficult, definitely beyond the scope of any of this.
Yeah. In addition to looking at how is exacerbate the polarization that we look at in this model, that was geographic differences. So if the ties are instead in group instead of we like analytics.
Yeah, in other work, I have done that. If you had like, broad national social ties where everyone was connected to everyone, that would certainly help. Of course, what, would be the worst would be social ties that are at a national level, but are also sort of self-selected, or like media ties or social media. It is true that a surprising amount of online interaction, well, at least Facebook friends tend to be surprisingly geographically located. I'm not sure about Twitter, although Twitter is used by a smaller portion of the populace than people active on Twitter like to assume. But my point was less so that the social ties exacerbate polarization and more that the social ties serve as a check against polarization, but that check works best at the local level, rather, where you actually personally know the people who you disagree with, as opposed to at the national level. I think it'd be hard to create national social ties.
We can talk more often, but have you looked at model? I think like the result there is like if even there's like a tiny bit of everyone that's in
Yeah, I'm not familiar with the details of that model. I think, like I said, I'm sort of skeptical in general about models that assume we can predict how people form their political opinions. When I say social ties, it's less that like, oh, I'm surrounded by neighbors who disagree with me, so I move my opinion, and more like I'm surrounded by people who disagree with me, so I have more respect for opinions that differ from my own, or I'm willing to like compromise without even actually changing my opinion. But I think, there are all these models of, oh yeah, people just form their opinions by, iterating on some sort of graph or this or that. And I don't think, I think the way people actually form their opinions is very complicated. And I do think there's this like natural human tendency as well to differentiate as well as to move towards opinions. But yeah, but happy to talk more offline as well.
Any other questions? Maybe one last one, just to Allison's point about large redistributed projects, where I was thinking about vaccination, that when policies are very local in their effects, then you can sort of evolve an issue without, I think, like something like vaccination, you can't just let an independent community not vaccinate because then you get resistance. So is that kind of the critical trade-off here between deciding whether to make issues at the resolved at the highest scale or like leaving them to the lower scales? You're trading off like people get the policy that they're happy with, and
right. It's like this center one here of yeah. I mean, I think the reason the whole reason for economies of scale is one reason to become bigger, but like one of the biggest reasons for government is this coordination that like things have externalities. And I think that is very important. But given like if you want the federal government, let's say, to be trustworthy to a lot of people when it comes to something like vaccination, where it comes to these really important coordination issues, then you might want to be like, well, maybe, when I absolutely have to, I use the federal government, but, in light of this, like maybe like save it for those issues I really need to, like redistribution, like that, and maybe like keep the federal government out of as many things as not absolutely necessary to preserve it for those cases where it really is needed. That's how I would look at it. Now, of course, people might disagree with what's really needed, but I think there's this sort of short-sighted tendency of, and this is how like bureaucracies grow of, oh, well, this would make things better in the short run. Oh, and this would make things better in the short run. And oh, I can make things better like this. And you just keep adding these things on. But then long run, you've like eroded something very important, and you've accumulated a lot of technical debt in your system. And I think you're, in the place where you are now. I could say the same of academia, in that, academia used to be trusted. And I think they, abuse that trust with a lot of, models that just turned out to be very wrong, either regarding like economics and free trade or financial crisis. But a lot of other stuff too, like nutrition and whatnot. So there's this thing where, and also I think like just a very strong political bias, especially in social science and humanities, also eroded a lot of trust. And so then, when it comes to something like vaccine efficacy, for academics like us, we know how to look at the literature and be like, oh yeah, but this is trustworthy literature. Like this is actually solid. But for most people, it's like, well, how do I tell what academics papers are good and what part of like the 90% that don't replicate? How do I know? And so, I just think that's another example of really like preserving like neutrality for where you like really need it.
That's great. Thank you very much. You now have. Okay, cool. So, if your kind of just like stick around.